Thanks very much for inviting me. I've learned a lot and I've very much enjoyed the session so far. And what I really want to talk about today is something I think kind of rhymes with what Glenn has recently just been saying. And that's to talk about the challenge, really, of incorporating AI into the user interface for research websites. And more generally, about what we lose in the process, what we're in danger of losing in the process. If we don't think hard about how our current interfaces work and what happens when complex forms are replaced by iterative dialogue. One of the things that I think historians and library professionals and designers have been really bad about is thinking about the unstated learning that goes on in the process of a research journey. My background is in the development of websites giving access to historical data. The most widely used of the sites I've been involved with is the Old Bailey Online. And from the first years of the web, back in the 1990s, what most users were confronted with was a straightforward search screen with a series of more or less complex boxes demanding specific types of information. Even Google, with its all-powerful white box and a blank white screen, hides a traditional search form under its advanced search options, which is the image you're seeing at the moment. If you could move that image on, that'd be great. These types of search forms were themselves developments from the world of 19th century government and archiving. They look and feel like the sorts of forms generated by European civil servants from the 1850s onwards. And the point about them is that they all map onto notions of structured data. In the 1850s, the forms sent out by endless parliamentary inquiries were organized around the structure of the ledgers into which the data would be entered. And in the 1990s and 2000 and 2010s, this same notion of congruence was simply reproduced online, both in historical websites and in all kinds of government archives. If you could move that slide on, that'd be great. All my own sites are built around large bodies of text given structure through XML markup. The markup worked like a 19th century ledger and demanded a search form that mapped against the XML. But whether you package the data as spreadsheet or database or XML or whatever, that congruence remains between the search form on the one hand and the data it gave you access to. And in many ways, that was a terrible thing. Just a form of intellectual indoctrination, encouraging you to think in a particular way. 19th century bureaucrats were very good at forcing you to think in a particular way, as Foucault, among others, have demonstrated. But what it did have is one overwhelming positive. It forced the user to acknowledge the structure of the underlying data. To be used well, you needed to know at least a bit about what you were interrogating. Anyone who has tried to fill out a tax form in a foreign country will have been confronted by the impact of unacknowledged but powerful assumptions embedded in the form itself. And in every application of AI I've seen, this traditional search form has been replaced by a conversational box inviting dialogue in prose. And in the process, it's eliminated the need for the user to interrogate and understand the underlying data structure. And in the short term, that's not a big problem. One of the great wonderments of the moment is that Claude or Gemini or whatever seem to engage with users at their level. And most of us know what the data they're looking for looks like. But replacing a search form with a conversation puts that greater distance between the user and the object of study, and essentially circumvents the point on the learning curve where frustration at not getting the answer you're looking for forces you to look again at the data to understand it better. And my concern is that for those of us who care about context and the analysis of old data or new data, who think knowing what you're looking for is part of being an effective scholar and looking at, this generates a substantial new intellectual challenge. In some respects, we've been worrying at this for 20 years. And just before AI hit the headlines just a few years ago, there were initiatives like data sheets for data sets out of Google that sought to formalize standards and systems of structured data. My own intervention in this area was to advocate and build a series of macroscopes for search results, designed to expose the shape of the object of study. It was essentially an attempt to visualize what an archival collection looked like before you got into the interrogation process. But this doesn't really do the work. And if you could move on the slide, that'd be great. Actually, move on to the next one. Yeah. But it doesn't really do the work. In a context where the user never needs to go near the data, where that distance between search and the data object is ever wider, when asking for a visualization of 1 million data points simply generates a very compelling graph, the natural tendency will be to simply accept it. At the same time, that there are a couple things to do. At least where we are embedding AI-driven features in more traditional websites, that endless dialog boxes in the bottom right, we can insist that answers include details about sources, which has already been discussed numerous times already this afternoon, or indeed macroscope representations of the data set. And we can be a lot clearer for ourselves about how we represent the data we make available. One of my frustrations is that, well, very few archives or websites of any kind actually show you what you're searching. It's incredibly difficult, unless you've been, for example, at work in an old school paper archive, to know how a catalog of a modern archive works. That hierarchy doesn't actually make sense, partly because it's represented badly on screen. Archives need to find new ways of exposing the shape of the data they hold and how any individual query or indeed any visualization sits within that data. In my mind's eye, we can design into that research journey the process of getting to understand the data set, but we need to be much more self-conscious about it than we are at the moment. I don't have a worked out solution or even really a strategy, but it strikes me that thinking a bit harder about how user interfaces direct the user to learn about the object of study is a good starting point in what clearly looks like a substantial job in the redesign of how the web works and looks and sounds. At the moment, AI user interfaces are hiding behind interfaces that feel human, and that is, if you like, their great trick. I just want to make those interfaces a little bit more weird, to complicate them a bit more, to force to think about that research journey, so that while that undergraduate or professional historian or whoever is struggling their way down into the details and long graphs of a subject, they're forced in the process to actually engage with the fact that what they're looking at is a distinct, unique archival object. Thanks much.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. Fantastic.